If we had to summarize the trends that we see developing during this period in thought about the nature of the mind and its relationship to the world, we see that pluralism as a framework for ontology largely fades from prominence during this second period. However, monistic substance idealism emerges as another candidate ontological framework, though only really briefly. The two main contending ontological frameworks become mind-body oppositional substance dualism and monistic substance physicalism. Theorists start to become aware, explicitly aware, of the explanatory challenges posed by each framework and the need to meet those challenges. So, in the case of monism, monistic theories face the difficulty of formulating mechanisms or accounts within their substance category that plausibly explain the various properties and processes that seem prima facie different from the properties easily accommodated by their substance category. In other words, if I'm a monistic physicalist, then I've got my substance with a set of characteristic fundamental properties that are the physical properties. Explaining their manifestation is just part of what it is to be a physical substance. Explaining how it is that that substance with those properties can also prima facie give rise to properties that are oppositional in nature, i.e. mental properties. This becomes the explanatory challenge. So I can explain length and width, I can explain acceleration, I can explain all these plausible physical properties fairly straightforwardly. But how do I use those properties to explain how it is that I have a qualitative experience of, say, pain? When we look at dualism, oppositional substance mind-body dualism faces the difficulty of formulating accounts of how these two fundamentally different kinds of substances that are characterized by definitive sets of oppositional properties, could possibly interact in such a seemingly continuous and seamless fashion. We start to see theorists attempt to adhere to scientific methodology in their research, or at least be inspired by developments in science in research of the time. Though, as with Descartes, their conceptions of such methodologies tend to differ quite dramatically from actual scientific methodology. So if you read Descartes' discourse on method, the methodology that he discusses is quite different from the methodology that he seemed to employ in his empirical work. Researchers often model their theories upon successful scientific theories, and we see this with Locke. Analogies, however, appear more superficial than structural in many cases. Researchers appeal to and often seek to explain empirical data and experiments in their theories, though as with Hume, the data most often falls under the rubric of anecdotal, incomplete, or partially understood evidence, and the experiments are largely counterfactual thought experiments, though not always. Finally, theorists begin to rely more heavily on introspective data when speculating about the nature of the mind and its operations, and we start to see the emergence of a two-track research program where, on the one hand, there's attempts to try and integrate things like physiology, anatomy, causal concepts into the ontological framework in order to better tie the ontological framework to phenomenon. On the other hand, the development of the theory about the elements of the mind and their interactions and operations tends to rely much more heavily on introspective data offered up by theorists about how the mind works, generally collected merely from their own introspections regarding themselves. In the next lecture, we'll focus on the dualistic and monistic ontological frameworks that emerge and are prominent in that period from the Enlightenment leading up to about the first third of the 20th century. We'll review some of the arguments that get developed during that time in order to try and mediate between the various frameworks to try and determine the most promising framework with which to structure inquiry about the nature of the mind and its interaction with the physical world.